if you live in certain time zones, especially if you live in the great old US of A, you'll know that it is later in the day than you'd expect, especially in my part of the great old USA. But we are still making a video because I promised you guys, loyal subscribers, I did not expect to make part 4. Guys, I wanted to make just 2 parts of this, but it got so long that I had to make 3, and now I have to make 4, and I'm probably going to have to make 5 and 6 and 7. I don't care. I just have to finish this series about the colonization of the Americas. So this is going to be the last time where you're going to hear me say there's going to be a new number of episodes, because I don't care how many episodes there are. Plus, more episodes are better for my subscriber count, which is steadily going. Anyways, today's video is part 4 of the colonialism of the Americas. This is Matt Man here. Let's just jump into it. Yeah! Okay, that was a weird way to start the episode, but let's just move on to what we were talking about last time when we finished. Last episode had a bit of an abrupt ending because someone came to my house and I had to abruptly stop the video, but the video was getting long anyway, so I think you guys get the point. So no more time wasting here. Chop chop, let's go. So, one of the first things that happened when all of this was going on in South America, which we've been overlooking recently, is that the Native Americans in the southern part of the continent started to lose their status as some of the only unaffected tribes in the Americas. Same thing happened to the Inuktitut and Nadene peoples of Canada, as these tribes started to feel the wrath of the last plague that would sweep through the Americas, killing another 1% of the Native American population and reducing it from about 2 million to 1, cutting it in half. So, these parts of the world had not been touched as effectively as Brazil, Mexico, the central United States. They were a lot less touched, and because of that, it started an opportunity for new powers to cash in. Many powers tried their luck with the Atlantic coast. Here, there weren't as many profound settlements as in Latin America there were. Brazil had also tried to counter the Spanish influence by expanding further into the Brazilian region. Brazil became an important export and economic land due to sugar, as well as this also became the main resource in the Caribbean. Sugar became a very important resource for one reason. Europeans liked the taste of it. It was also good for a new topic that I haven't very densely covered on this channel yet, but I guess it's time to cover it. Slavery. Unfortunately, about 400 to 500 years ago, the Atlantic slave trade started up. This brought slaves from their home continent of Africa, native Africans who lived in Africa, to be taken away by Europeans and sent to the Americas and forced to work with no pay, which is kind of unfair. They were the ones who were stripping down all the sugar, doing all of the work with cotton and tobacco and stuff like that, and they were the ones who were doing all of the work and because of this, it created a labor force. And labor forces are never good, especially when they are enforced. So, when slaves were brought to the Americas, they were used as property, and they could be sold from different slave owners to others. It was all up to the owner of the slaves. Eventually, some cultures stopped the slavery entirely, like Brazil much later would. The Spanish, there's a big debate that the Spanish densely practiced slavery. On some reports, it's proven that the Spanish practiced slavery heavily in earlier years. But in other reports, it almost seems like the Spanish didn't practice slavery at all. The French were also a complicated story with their slave trade in the Americas, at least. Later, when the French would form their biggest empire in Africa and move away from the Americas, they had a massive slavery rampage over there, and just and unfortunately the genocide of many African cultures, which is very unfortunate. However, in the Americas at the time, there was little need for slaves up in Canada. And at the time, there were really little need for slaves at all than in the southern parts of the continent. But much later, towards the end of the story, in fact, that began to change. But that deserves another video, because that topic is even more complicated than this one. New countries on Europe thought that they could exploit England's and Portugal's recent weaknesses. These countries included the Netherlands and Sweden, who thought they could capitalize on the slave trade and decided to make a buck off of it. Sweden started by purchasing a colony in Africa. Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark tried their way with this as well, especially by patrolling and controlling the modern-day Gold Coast in modern-day Ghana. However, many of these colonies were overshadowed by larger German, Portuguese, Dutch, and English colonies also in the region. The Polish-Lithuanians eventually gave up their colonization attempt after the Duchy of Courland fell to Swedish forces in the Great Northern War. Now you may ask, what the heck is the Duchy of Courland? The Duchy of Courland was essentially a state in modern day Latvia that consisted of the western parts of that country's landmass. And it was a fiefdom, I believe, of the Polish state. This fiefdom included lands in Latvia, in western Latvia, to be sure. And this fiefdom had a very very crazy idea of establishing Courland as a colonial empire. So they eventually tried to form colonies all over the globe, but all of them failed, and none of them were able to survive after Courland's annexation into the Swedish dominion. The Swedish and Dutch also tried their luck in the Americas. The Dutch tried their luck by establishing the colony of New Amsterdam, whereas it would later be renamed New York. But that is also a story for another time. The Swedish, rooted out by their Dutch and English counterparts, were only able to found a small colony on the north end of the Delmarva Peninsula. This colony, named Wilhelmstad, was lost and paid no attention to years later. The colony eventually fell apart and was annexed by the Dutch. When the Dutch colony annexed the Swedish colony, during the Anglo-Dutch Wars, a deal was brokered. In exchange for the colony of Suriname and other rights to other territories that the English had previously stolen from the Dutch, these territories would be given back in exchange for the profitable colony of New Amsterdam. And thus, two new colonies were created, the colonies of New York and New Jersey, which became some of the most influential states in today's day. Also, the Plymouth colony was the colony on the northern shore past this landmass to the east of Manhattan, which is now called Long Island, had also gone through some changes as well. The new colonies of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Saybrook, New Haven, and Connecticut had been established, making the northeastern region a whole mess of political English colonies. Meanwhile, France's sole and only colony, the New France or Quebec colony, kept growing into the maritime Acadian region, where the Micmac Native Americans lived and traded. The French were able to expand their colonial dominion into fur trading territories, and like I talked about in my beaver video, were able to conquer essentially the entire fur trade under their colony of New France. They even formed another colony in Louisiana. This eventually, however, the French did meet their decline, but that would be much, much later. The English and French had recently discovered that they were each on each other's continent now, and when they first met each other, they didn't get along that well. The English and the French competed over who should rule North America. Should the English win over, or the French, the English would become the rulers of North America and would be able to project their power against the French and all around the globe. If the French Empire were to win, the English Empire would be smacked back out of France and back into England, and the Plantagenet dynasty would come to an end, which it eventually did. Around this time, the last of the Tudor dynasty, Queen Elizabeth, was laid dead, and because of that, it led to a succession crisis. You see, to understand this, we actually have to go back into British medieval history, which I'm going to have a very fun time explaining, guys. So basically, how the ordeal went is that when King Henry VIII died, his throne laid to his youngest son, Edward. However, Edward, after only being king for a few years, died, and the throne was passed on to his sister, Mary. Mary, after going crazy, and is also where the tomato drink Bloody Mary gets its name from, eventually died without an heir, and the crown again passed to her sister, Elizabeth. However, when Elizabeth died, she became the second heirless queen in a row, which led to the entire English household collapsing because everyone up the family tree was either now dead or wasn't fit to rule the throne. So what they ended up having to do was borrow some of Scotland's royal line to tie things back together, and technically Scotland did have some blood connections, but because of Scotland's loose blood connections, this is why England ended up with a part Scottish king, and the line of succession kept going from down there. But I actually have to mention Scotland because they had some pretty good efforts too. Before the Panama Canal, many nations had interest in forming a canal in one of these three spots: the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, Nicaragua, or Panama. The Isthmus of Tehuantepec was considered too mountainous and too of a large gap to build a large canal through. The Nicaragua canal plan still has some traction even to this day, but was largely ignored, leaving the Panama Canal as the best option. Similarly to the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal is a man-made waterway that only existed until recently. However, many nations have died trying to create this Panama Canal. First, there was the Scottish, who did a very bold attempt to form a colony in Panama. However, they grossly miscalculated the mountains and the trees and the humidity and everything, and because of that, they were failure number one. Failure number two came in hands of the Spanish. However, they essentially didn't put enough effort into it from the start, so they failed as well. Then came along the English, who wanted to control the seas. However, similarly to the Spanish, with lack of interest, they didn't create a canal later. The only real interest that ever came was the French, who tried to build the canal, however failed due to diseases and ended up giving up years later. Finally, there was the great old US of A, which became the fifth nation to start work on a possible canal plan in Panama, and became the only nation to succeed, and will be the last nation to succeed because we won't need another canal. So after the USA succeeded, which is another story, and this is the time when I get back to the video, which is actually about 1500s America instead of 1920s America, and Theodore Roosevelt. So, did I write Tudor here? Why did I do that? Okay, France. There. So, now that we're back to the video finally, now you probably know what's going on with Louisiana. Well, Louisiana became a French colony. This was partially to counter Spain's influence in the Gulf of Mexico, but also because of the very profitable crops of the region. This is sometimes seen as the start of American slavery, because quickly in the South, the population began to become more and more black. The same practices were conducted in Virginia, Maryland, and the new colony of Delaware, and as well, and possibly even Florida. Slaves became a part of the South, and slavery didn't really die off as many people perceived it that it was going to. After a lot of reforms, by a long time ago, the colonies looked a little bit more like this, and there had been some important changes. The first change was that the map no longer looked like this, but it looked a little more like, well, let me just draw it for you so you can get the picture. It looked a little more like, okay guys, you're going to see my drawing, but I'm not actually going to be doing anything. Okay, right, guys, bye. Okay, it looked a little bit more like this. As you can see, some colonies died off, some colonies came into being, and there were some colonies in the middle that never really changed at all. New York and Virginia had expanded to over 5 times their previous size. That Massachusetts colony had absorbed the Plymouth colony and become very powerful. The new colony of Pennsylvania had been established with a new city called Philadelphia, which quickly dwarfed all of the other cities in the Americas and became the largest one. And some other places too, like Maryland, Delaware, New Hampshire, yeah, all of the good stuff. Anyways, there was also a new colony that Britain had little interest in, but soon became very important. Carolina, or should I say Carolinas, because later on they were split into 2 Carolinas, South Carolina and North Carolina, but still often treated as one because their populations were less than 15,000 at the time. And because of that, this is partially why Britain had little interest in them. Same thing goes for the Carolinas' Georgian cousin, the colony of Georgia, which became the last colony to be established out of the original 13. Because of Georgia's late addition to the group, it was treated even more like just some rural area than the Carolinas were, with only a quarter of the Carolinian population, and most of that was just slaves. And this is where slavery began to actually get profitable. Now, let me change the map in some other places because the British, Spanish, French, and a lot of other countries had been to war a lot, and that had changed the map a lot. So now a better map would probably look like this. Brazil got expanded a lot. Peru got expanded a lot. And no one's built that canal yet. And New Spain hasn't done anything anymore. France has also connected their two colonies together so they can get more of a monopoly on trade. And England is setting their sights on the Hudson's Bay area. Or should I say the UK, because the United Kingdom, England and their Scottish neighbors to the north united to form the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So I shouldn't call these English anymore, but rather I should call them British, because that is the correct term nowadays. So these new Brits were not very happy that France still controlled all of this. Remember 30 seconds ago when I was talking about that little colony up here? Well, that little colony is about to become a big colony called Canada. You may have heard of it. But if you want to see how Canada evolved, you're going to have to wait till the next video. Haha, surprise! This is Matt Man, signing off.